Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 advisory group, and also I teach history at Suffolk University. And our guest today is William Martin, who has been called the king of the historical thriller, not an inaccurate description. He is the author of 12 novels, and the one we're going to talk about today is Citizen Washington. Bill, thank you for joining us.
Bob, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
And I think it's appropriate today that we reflect briefly on the passing of David McCullough, one of the real giants in historical writing, someone who probably did more than anyone to bring John Adams into the public consciousness again, and also to make history really important to people outside the academy, where it really belongs. So,
And
we
today,
both had, yes. Go on,
Today I was thinking about, and actually posted it on Facebook, a memory of a meal that I had with him probably 25 years ago. After I had finished writing and narrating an episode of The American Experience called George Washington, the Man Who Wouldn't Be King. And so I got to know David a little bit before that, but then during the American Experience work as well. And we were having dinner with a couple of other people, and he said, "You know, Bill," and I won't do the David impersonation. There's a great novel to be written about George Washington and the American Revolution. And I thought to myself, "Oh, that's not a bad idea." And then a few years later, my agent brought up the same topic, and I said, "Funny you should mention that." And it was out of that combination of advice from two people whom I respected that I decided I'm going to write a novel about George Washington, which I did. David McCullough planted the seed, and my agent nurtured it. So that was a nice memory from David, but
very appreciant.
Yeah,
and I think,
he went off. He went off and wrote 1776 as well. He decided to take his own advice basically and focus on that single year, and that's a remarkable book.
It is. It really is a remarkable book, and of course John Adams has really a life of its own, evolving into the series, and really well deserved to bring Adams back. And I think he started off thinking about doing a joint biography of Jefferson and Adams, and he realized John Adams was the more interesting character.
Yeah. As he said, he had planned to write about their two competing visions of what America should be: the mercantile, educated, potentially industrially driven America that Adams envisioned versus the agrarian society of Jefferson. And he said, Adams won. So I decided to write about Adams and his vision rather than about the two of them.
Yeah. I think as a writer, too, one of the things that really strikes me about the Adams book is just about every paragraph ends in John Adams's voice, because you have the Adams letters, the Adams writings that are so vivid. The more you read of Jefferson, the less you know about Jefferson. He hides in his writing, whereas Adams is really displaying himself.
That's true.
And all of his crankiness. And so you got into, though, Washington also figures in your first book, Back Bay. It's the Revere tea set made for Washington's dinner at Faneuil Hall.
Actually, George Washington appears, I think, in maybe half of the books that I've written. Back Bay, Cape Cod. Actually, I cut him out of Cape Cod. Citizen Washington, he's in Annapolis. He shows up in Annapolis because, of course, he was there all the time. And one of his great moments is in Annapolis when he surrenders his commission to Congress, which is sitting at the Annapolis State House in 1783. And then he also appears in The Lost Constitution and in Citizen Washington. And he's, I guess, been something of a touchstone for my career. That first book, that first scene in Faneuil Hall in Back Bay was based on a scene that had actually occurred, in which Washington, on his presidential tour to America in 1789, or presidential tour to New England in 1789, had a banquet held in his honor at Faneuil Hall. And all of the things that I explore in that banquet regarding his dealings with John Hancock, who was trying to make a point over the fact that the governor should be the sovereign in the state and the president merely his guest. So the president should pay the first call on the governor, et cetera, et cetera. All of that stuff that opens Back Bay was actually going on that night. That whole trip to Boston is quite an interesting story. He actually passed probably a few miles away from where I'm sitting right now on his way into the city. But he has existed in my novels for since the very beginning. And actually, that Washington that's depicted in that first book, Back Bay, has a little bit of the Gore Vidal Washington in him, because back then, when I was in my late 20s writing that book, I was reading Burr by Gore Vidal.
Right.
And of course, the depiction of Washington in that book is of a pockmarked dullard with port-stained teeth and a big rear end, which is a very unfair portrait of Washington. And Vidal is writing in the voice of Aaron Burr, so what would you expect?
Right. Yeah. So what have been the other fictional depictions of Washington, I mean, that you encountered over the years? As you're trying to get at your Washington, and then there are a lot of others who appear. And
one that jumps to mind is the George Washington in a book called Johnny One Eye. One of those books that Jonathan, I can't think of the title, the author, I'm sorry. The book is called Johnny One Eye, and it's about the siege of New York. And in one, the author decides that he's going to play with the story of George Washington even more than Burr does in the Gore Vidal novel. And George Washington falls in love with one of the prostitutes on the Holy Ground. And in that novel, George Washington, after the Continental Army has been driven from New York and is stumbling across the New Jersey plain, decides he misses her. And he sneaks back into New York and sits down in the house.
Wow.
Right there on Vesey Street, right next to St. Paul's Chapel. And plays 21, 21, blackjack with his opposite number, General Howe. And
my goodness,
you see stuff like that and you say, obviously that author had a very different intent than I have in my novels, which is to capture him either as a sort of comet shooting across the sky of the story and illuminating characters or forcing them to illuminate themselves, or as in the case of Citizen Washington, the long novel that I published in 1999 about the life of George Washington, to tell the story as best I can tell it, which is what I did by modeling it almost after Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane, of course, the big question is Rosebud. What does Rosebud mean? And a newspaper editor sends a young man out across America to find out what rosebud really means, and out of that flows all of the
Right.
narrative that creates the character of Citizen Kane. And
Right.
well, at his death, Martha Washington burned all of his letters,
Mm-hmm.
all the letters between them. We only have one or two actual letters that he sent to her during their whole life apart, 8 years of the Revolution and everything else. And I thought to myself, there's the rosebud. There's the opportunity to give this novel a jumping off point and something that will hold it all together. As a young writer in 1800, right after Washington's death, sets out across America just before the upcoming and particularly virulent election of 1800, to try to find out who Washington was. And he encounters a dozen narrators, some of them fictional, some of them historical, each of whom tells his or her own story as a way of getting at Washington. And the largest idea overarching the story is that all of us, in some way, have our own Washington. He might be the first American to be set in stone, but all of us, I think, every person has a somewhat different opinion of him than the next person. And I was just trying to get under that, to get beneath the stone, to take down the pedestal and get to the man. And this was the way that I did it.
Right. Jonathan Lane, our producer and very well-read, erudite individual, tells us that the author of Johnny One-Eye was Jerome Cheron. So,
Thank you. I was going to say Jonathan Cheron, but you got it right. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think you do this looking at Washington from these different perspectives, and to me, one of the many interesting things about the book is Hesperus Draper, the publisher who sets this in motion, is really trying to not get at Washington, but get Washington. That is
right.
So it changes for the young guy, his nephew, who is the young reporter sent out. How does your view of Washington change in the course of writing the book and doing all of these people's stories? I mean, you're not simply reflecting what each one thinks about Washington, but there must be a William Martin Washington in there at some point.
Right. Well, I am shaping him and shaping them as the story goes along. And once you've begun to study Washington, you see a man who comes on the scene with a certain set of expectations. As I wrote in the American Experience, he began as a grasping, land-hungry young surveyor. Somehow, he grew into a leader who would do something that no general has done in 1,000 years. When battles were won and the victories achieved, he gave up power. And not only did he do it once, he did it twice.
Right.
He was constantly growing into new roles. As I also say in one of those passages, he played the roles and became the characters. He loved theater. He loved acting, as we know. And I can't remember who it was who said he was probably the greatest actor we shall ever have in the presidency. He obviously hadn't seen Bedtime for Bonzo. It was John Adams, actually, who had that. And
John Adams wasn't fond of actors.
No. And in many of the instances where Washington takes a new job, because it's been forced on him, he doesn't want to do it. He didn't, even though he put on the uniform of the Virginia Regiment when he went to the Second Continental Congress. He he was very worried about taking
Mhm.
on the leadership of that army. I think he
Mhm.
says it in the speech to them, or in a letter to Congress, or in a letter to his wife, uh, from the day that I take this commission, I date the fall and ruin of my reputation.
Right.
And
Mhm.
yet he would soldier on, as he
Mhm.
always did, and and achieve greatness. He would learn on the job, and
Mhm.
you saw that when he was a surveyor. You saw
Mhm.
that when he was a young man with Braddock, and in his days with the Virginia Regiment fighting in the French and Indian War.
Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, and at every stop along the way, he would learn something and gain some kind of knowledge that would help him to grow as a man. He's
Right.
constantly growing throughout
Oh yeah.
his, and we grow with him in a way when we
Mhm.
study. Uh,
Yeah.
he maintains, from the beginning, certain human aspects that I liked
Mhm.
exploring. He uh, he has a yearning for another man's wife when he's a young man, Sally
Mhm.
Fairfax. That's pretty well established now.
Mhm.
He he takes advantage, after the French and Indian War, of the opportunity to grab some of the bonus lands of the
Mhm.
West and set aside for enlisted men. He grabs some of
Mhm.
them for himself and for the other officers. He understood from the very beginning of his life that land is the most permanent estate
Yeah.
and the most
Mhm.
likely to increase in value. And he was always grasping land. It's one of the reasons I think that he became a surveyor when he was young, because
Mhm.
those who surveyed the land got the first look at the best
Right.
land.
Right.
And, um, you know, he was, as a young man, a man on the make. He was
Mhm.
uh, the second, or was it the third son of a middling Virginia tobacco
Yeah.
planter. And actually, in the novel, at one point, I described the social structure of
Mhm.
Virginia, which can be defined by exactly where you are in relationship to the coast.
Right.
Uh, the people who live along the Tidewater uh, are the upper crust. They got there first and got the best
Mhm.
land, most fertile
Mhm.
lands near the ocean, along the rivers. The people up near the fall lines, where the rivers
Mhm.
become less navigable, which included the Washington family at their Fredericksburg farm.
Mhm.
Those people are kind of the middle class, and then the
Mhm.
poor are out there in the woods, as I
Right.
describe it in the novel many times. Them dark, wet woods, a dark
Mhm.
and Manichaean place, which is, I think, how most people saw that
Yeah.
that that Western country, but a place where a man of any kind, if he was
Mhm.
lucky, ambitious, could
Mhm.
achieve something that would that would separate him from the pack. And I think that's why Washington was always looking for the frontier in those early years of his
Yeah.
life.
Yeah. Yeah.
You better ask
We're
me another question, because I'm just
okay.
exploring.
This is good. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're talking with William Martin, the author of Citizen Washington, along with 11 other novels. And one of the things, really, you kind of alluded to this. Washington's mind. We have people like Franklin, Hamilton, Jefferson, even John Adams, true intellectuals, people who would be able to hold their own in debate, in writing, and so on. And Washington is somewhat different, and he seems to be conscious of this. That's why he has people like Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison write speeches for him, letters for him. And Jefferson makes some remarks about his mind wasn't a first rate. Can you talk a little bit about Washington's mind and the temper of it? Is that an unfair characterization, like Gore Vidal's, or that he was
Yeah.
not quite as smart as we are?
I think it was most of them liked his physical presence. Let's
Yeah.
just talk about the Second Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have said or written, and I can't cite where you can find it, but I've seen it in a couple of places. He looks at Washington there in the Second Continental Congress in the uniform. He says he was by far the most graceful big man I have ever seen. Because Washington was 6'3" in an era when the tallest men were 5'7", 5'8". He was by far the most graceful big man I have ever seen. He moved easily, sat easily, and had such an excellent sense of his own inner life that he did not seem in the least uncomfortable, that he did not have as much to say as some of the other men in the room. He kept his counsel. People believed that he was keeping his counsel not because of the old adage that it is better to keep your mouth shut than to open it. Better to keep your mouth shut and be thought a fool than to open it and remove all doubt.
Right. Yeah.
Believed that he kept his counsel because he would only say something when he really had something significant to say. And I think that's true of him. His mind, as I wrote in the novel, ground slowly, but it was exceedingly fine. And he had to have a certain degree of diffidence in a room full of men educated at Harvard, like John Adams or William and Mary, or any of the other colleges that most of those men had come from, King's College in New York. And he had been self-educated. But when you go to Mount Vernon, and I remember this from the first day we shot down there, when we made the American Experience. You look at the titles in his library, and you realize that he was an enormously self-made man.
Right.
He studied extensively in the agricultural texts of the day. He loved theater. He was widely read, and I think that helped him. But it was his stature and his ability, as I said earlier, to play the role and become the character that carried him from Philadelphia on to Boston in June of 1775. Adams, what's the great passage from Adams as he watches him ride away? Adams has nominated him to be the general, much to the chagrin of John Hancock, who had no military experience at all, but who thought, well, maybe I can do this. At least Washington had led armies and had fought bravely with Braddock on the Monongahela and in other places. And Adams says, he rides off to glory, and I, poor scribbler, must stay here. And I can't remember, but John Adams could become very petulant and self-pitying when an opportunity presented itself. Later on, he said Washington achieved the status that he did because he was the tallest Hebrew in the tribe. It was the term that he used in referring to Washington as part of a minion.
Right. Yeah.
But the Washington who got to New York on his way to Boston said something very significant in New York when they had a reception for him. By then, they knew that Bunker Hill had happened, and he was trying to get here as quickly as possible. But he stopped for a banquet, and they extolled him, but they warned him, that he was just the general of the army, and everybody was, this was a democracy they were trying to build. I can't remember the exact wording of the admonishment that comes in a proclamation that they give him. But he said to that group, when we laid aside when we took on the role of the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. He would
Right.
always carry that in his head. There's a book that Washington studied when he was a young man, or boy, actually,
Mhm.
a book that most boys of that time studied. It was a publication that had been written by the Jesuits for the
Yeah. The rules of
called The
civility. Yeah.
Rules of Civility and Decent Company and Conversation.
Mhm.
And it laid out in 100 little aphorisms how a man should conduct himself in the world.
Mhm.
One, or rule number one, some gesture of politeness should be made to any person whom you meet entering a room. Very nice.
Mhm.
Then they get
Mhm.
very specific. In the next line, they say, when at table, do not clean your teeth with with the napkin, fork, or knife. Only use a toothpick.
Mm.
Rule number 6 is one that I always had used when I speak to audiences about Washington. Sleep not while others speak. Uh, really matters. The one that
Yeah.
carried him, I think, through his life, uh, from the beginning to the end, and certainly from Philadelphia on to Boston and through 8 years of the Revolution,
Mhm.
was rule number 100. Labor to keep alive in thy breast some small spark of that celestial fire called conscience.
Yes.
And that, I think, is when you're all done with Washington and you've tried to understand him from every different angle, and you've explored the meaning of reputation in the 18th century, and you've explored the evolution of the man from being the petulant young office seeker to the president who will happily hand over power to John Adams.
Mhm.
Uh, it's that rule 100 in
Right.
the rules of civility that he read when he was a boy that is
Mhm.
still resonating in his mind. That's what I think, anyway, about. I mean, we're all the child is father to the man. We are all
That's
products
true.
of what we have read and learned and taken to heart
Right.
in our youths, and that I think is the real key to Washington is in that little
That
aphorism.
that line. We're talking with William Martin, the author of Citizen Washington, along with other books on American history in the form of novels. Actually, that line I remember was on the wall in the middle school I went to in Florida with a
Yeah,
picture of Washington. So
yeah,
still carries a lot of weight with me,
sure.
thinking that, yes. And he does turn over power twice, and of
Mhm.
course, his surrendering the commission is one of Trumbull made a mural of that's in the Capitol building. Of course,
Right.
uh, returning, and he's going to retire from the theater of action as he does
Mhm.
this dramatic gesture.
Yeah.
And then, as president, steps down when there was no reason he should have. The thinking was the president would serve until he died, and we can
Yeah.
see. And I think it was King
It
George
was,
III when, yeah,
yeah.
go on.
Yeah.
The king said when he asked Benjamin West, what's Washington going to do now? He's won the war. And his
Yeah.
army is the only thing holding this place together. And West said, I imagine he'll go back to his farm. And the king says, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man in the world.
That's right. That's right. And of course, uh, the story of his action, uh, his speech in March of 1783, right before the end, there at Newburgh, is one of the greatest stories in American history, um, where uh, he
Yeah.
basically puts down a potential uh, fascist overthrow. I don't
Yes.
of the United States government,
Yeah.
one that is being driven by his own officers,
Mhm. Yeah.
who are angry, of course, at having not been paid by Congress, and they gather
Mhm.
at the New Windsor Cantonment, the big gathering place where the army is on the Hudson River there, and they're debating whether they should march on Philadelphia to demand their
Mhm.
pay. And Washington gets up in front of them with his speech, which it's a speech that is the Massachusetts Historical Society has the original copy of it. And you look at the speech today and you see that large, careful hand that Washington wrote the speech in. And he gets up and he gives the speech and he begs these officers not to open the floods of civil discord and drown our rising American empire in blood. And the speech doesn't go over. It doesn't play. It's still dead. And he then decides there's got to be something else. And so he puts out a letter from Congress, a letter from one of the congressmen promising that they are working on this pay issue and the officers are getting their money. And he starts to read it. He holds it up, and then he holds it back, and then he holds it. And then finally, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out spectacles and puts them on. And as it is written in a couple of primary sources, there is a great gasp in the room because very few of these officers have ever seen Washington wearing eyeglasses before. Actor that he is, he hears the audience. He looks out at them and he says, "You will forgive me, gentlemen, but not only have I grown gray in the service of my country, now I find myself going blind." And that was it. Potential uprising against the duly elected civil government in Philadelphia falls apart. Actor that he is, Washington knows that he's got him. He just walks off the stage.
That's it.
And reads the letter, and he gallops away. And at that moment, he basically averts what would have totally changed the look of this republic in the years ahead, and establishes precedents that can never be changed. People might try, but they can't be changed. He is, and the other thing about Washington that if we can just roll back to the beginning of the Revolution again and to the Continental Congress, the other thing about Washington that we have to remember is that during the 8 years that we've just traveled here from his trip to Boston to take command, that scene in the New Windsor Cantonment, he, more than anybody else, has been holding it all together. If in the arc of American democracy that we trace from 1775 to Washington's death at 1799, if we take anybody out of that archway, John Adams, Jefferson, Thomas Paine, any of those people, the structure will still hold. But Washington is the keystone. Washington holds that archway in place. And if you pull Washington out, revolution falls apart. There is not a man who is at the head who is serving with a sense of honor, a sense of understanding of what is expected of him by a society that holds him to very high standards. What you may end up with is Horatio Gates, or worse than that, Charles Lee, or some other British general who has escaped England but still believes in the royal structures and so on and so forth. Washington himself is he really is the thing that holds the revolution together and therefore allows the country to be born. So it's when you call him the father of his country, I think it's a fair description.
We're talking with William Martin, the author of Citizen Washington, as well as other books. And let me just ask you a little bit about, I remember you telling a story about one of your kids saying that you go upstairs every day and make up stories. But then this story of Washington doesn't come out of your head. You have to do a lot of research to get all of this right, plus to get the kinds of facts that an historian isn't going to notice. I mean, you have to really recreate this world. So how do you go about doing your research? Where do you start?
Well, fortunately, because I had worked on the episode of The American Experience, I had done a lot of the groundwork back in the early '90s for this book that I would write bring out in 1999. You, as always, you try to read some generalized text before you get started, and that's something I always do. And you carry in your head, say, a particular novel or novels that you want to be your template, your artistic touchstone here. Not that they may necessarily study the same material, but that they are in a way, technically in some way, like the book you're writing. And I reread, to get started, The Killer Angels. The Killer Angels, about the Civil War and about the Battle of Gettysburg, contains multiple narrative voices, Robert E. Lee, Longstreet, Chamberlain, etc., all of them describing their experience in the battle. And so I reread that to get started. Then I turned to Flexner. I read the one-volume Flexner, The Indispensable Man, and then later read the longer versions in selected areas. Douglas Southall Freeman, what is it, seven volumes on the life of Washington?
Yeah, right.
And then some of the shorter, more modern books about him, like James Thomas Flexner's book on Washington, which is very good. Not Flexner. Who's the? I can't think of his name.
I'm blanking.
I'll dig it out someday. But I read multiple, because don't forget, I wrote this book nearly 30 years ago now.
Right. Yeah.
But and you can still get it as an ebook or audio book.
Yes. Well, I think, and I tell people this even when you're not around, it is the best one-volume book on Washington. If someone says, what should I read to get to know Washington? I will point to Citizen Washington, because it does give you Washington in a way I don't think any academic historian does. Well, you really get the character of him as well as
I appreciate that. And the reason I think that might be the case is that I'm able to invent in the corners where no historical light shines. And the first scene of the book, of the actual series of narratives, comes from a fictional Mount Vernon slave. And he's in the room when Washington is born. And he describes those early years and Washington's relation to his mother, a woman who was probably pretty demanding. And everything that we read, Washington was good to her, but kind of held her at arm's length for as long as he could when he was a young man. Of course, after she passed away, he would say to his wife, whom he called Patsy, "Losing a parent is hard, Patsy, harder than I ever imagined." Well, what I tried to do as a writer in this book was as a researcher, was to find as many of the quotes as I could from Washington that humanized him. Tried to make sure that they were accurate in some way, and that they captured him and defined him, and then just got about the business of telling the best story that I could with him as the presence in every chapter and in every person's life. It was easier to do with the fictional characters, whose lives can kind of expand to fill the void that we can't really do when we are writing a narrative coming from John Adams. Fortunately, and I do write in Adams' voice. Fortunately, Adams is filled with a certain kind of bilious negativity about Washington. But even Adams gets worn down. And so you read as much as you can, and then you walk the ground wherever you can. And I find that this is very helpful when you're um, when you're out trying to find a way to bring a novel to life, bring a historical moment to life, to go to the place where it happened. It might not look the same, but the lay of the light will be the same, and there will be details that you will find that will be so unusual that they will bring an experience or a moment to life for the readers. For example, I went to a recreation of the British surrender on the field at Yorktown when I was writing the book, and it was in October, and there were probably 50, 75 British, and then some Continental troops at the end of this long field where the surrender actually occurred, and a character playing Washington. There are a lot of the guys who dressed as Washington, and you know, I captured the sound of the tramp of the feet of the British troops. The playing of the world turned upside down, the tune that the British used when they marched in, and so forth. The one thing that you'll never read anywhere, but which I saw that day, was as the British marched across the field. It's dry grass and sort of probably cut down hay and so forth. As they're walking, the wind is blowing and lifting the dried grass into the air. You don't read that anyplace else but in my. And it probably happened that day in 1781. And then, of course, you get to play the scene with Cornwallis's aide handing the sabre. Washington, actor that he is, he says, Cornwallis isn't here to hand the sword over. Well, I'm not going to take the sword from his subaltern. You give it to Major General Lincoln here.
Right.
And he was a genius at all of that stuff. And of knowing the right gesture in the right moment. He might not have been as learned or as verbally skilled as Adams or Jefferson, but none of them had that kind of skill that Washington showed in that moment, in that little gesture.
Right.
He was elevating us and telling the British, we are now your equals. Same thing had happened during the siege of New York when the British had decided to send him a letter to maybe give him an out. Maybe we can negotiate here. It was from the Howe brothers to what George Washington Esquire, I think is what they wrote. And they brought this letter into his office, and he said, I'm not going to open that. Send it back. That's not General of the Army. I'm not Esquire. And then they wrote it back with a series of et ceteras after the Esquire. He still wouldn't accept it. And whatever was in the letter, George Washington insisted that he be referred to as General George Washington. And it was one more of those efforts to establish and maintain the image of national sovereignty that we would build at the time.
Right. And the issue wasn't that they weren't giving him his title. It's not like he didn't call me professor, but you're not acknowledging that this is an independent country that can choose its own generals, that he has his commission from the choice of a free people, as he would put it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And
we
were you going to say? He understood that kind of gesture implicitly, and you saw it no matter where he was and what he did. And then he smart enough to keep his mouth shut most of the time.
That's right. Yeah, this is something Jefferson noticed, that the two most influential people he ever saw in a legislative body were Washington and Franklin, because neither one spoke, but when they did, people listened.
That's right. Yeah. At the Constitutional Convention, Washington didn't say anything.
No.
He basically upbraided somebody one day for losing his papers, basically he presided by calling the meetings to order and then gaveling them at the end. He, as Calvin Coolidge once said, "Nothing I never said ever came back to hurt me." And I think Washington understood that too.
He did, yes. Yeah. We've been talking with William Martin, the author of Citizen Washington, along with 11 other books. I think I'd like to hear you say just a few words about your most recent book, December 41, which is another great historical moment, terrific page turner. If you'd like to tell us a little, give us a tease so that we can, those who haven't read it can find a copy.
Well, it's a somewhat different genre than Citizen Washington, which is a real biographical novel.
Right.
December 41 is about the 2.5 weeks after Pearl Harbor. It begins on December 8th, 1941, with an FBI raid on a neo-Nazi compound in Southern California, a place you can still visit if you know where to look. They arrest everybody down there in that canyon, except for one guy who gets away. And he's the guy they should have caught, because his job is to get to Washington and shoot Franklin Roosevelt on the night he lights the national Christmas tree. This never happened, but the United States Secret Service, Mike Riley, who later wrote a book about it, the head of the Secret Service detail in the White House, Mike Riley admits they were very worried about that lone assassin or that small team that might try to get at the president. And I thought to myself when I read that, what a thriller this could make, particularly because the closer we get to Washington, D.C. on Christmas Eve, which is when they lit the Christmas tree, the more apparent it becomes that FDR is going to have a special guest with him that night, Winston Churchill. When the German figures this out, he realizes that he can basically win the war with 2 shots if he's good enough. And the story is about a lot of Americans from a lot of different walks of life who suddenly find themselves called upon to save the nation in this darkest couple of weeks by stopping that German assassin.
So you can see Washington
and
December 41.
For all the detail of what the 18th century looks like and feels like and smells like when you read Citizen Washington, you'll feel the same kind of detailing in this novel that begins in Hollywood, then travels across America on the famed Santa Fe Super Chief, and ends in Washington, D.C. In the 3 days before Christmas.
Churchill and Roosevelt, I think, would be the indispensable men of World War II, just as Washington was of the Revolution and the creation of the Republic.
That's true. And there is a remarkable piece of video that you can find on my website. There's a historical timeline on my website, williammartinbooks.com. The British newsreel company Pathé was allowed to put a camera right next to the podium on the night that FDR and Churchill gave their Christmas Eve speeches. And it's about 30 minutes of uninterrupted video of these 2 men who aren't at all aware of the camera. They're giving their speeches, they're relating to one another, and you feel, in a way, like an eavesdropper to history because of that newsreel. But when you go into the 18th century, you have to rely on the primary sources or on people like me to make you an eavesdropper to history. And I hope that I've done that in Citizen Washington, which has now been around for quite a long time. And I consider it, except for December 41, I always like the last one. If I have to take a book with me to talk my way in through the pearly gates, Well, Martin, what have you been doing for all the years
Yeah.
you've had on Earth? I'll wave Citizen Washington around because I think that in some ways it's the best book I ever wrote.
Very good. Well, thank you so much. And you do allow us to be eavesdroppers on history. We've been talking to William Martin, the author of Citizen Washington, along with other books. And thank you. Thanks for joining us, Bill. And
Well, thank you. It's always great to talk to you.
it is always great to talk to you. And I want to thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, and the other members of Rev 250. We're a consortium of about 70 organizations in and around Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the anniversaries of American independence. And this is our 101st podcast. We've had listeners on every continent. And we thought initially we'd have a handful of folks in and around Massachusetts, but I want to thank today the folks in Mount Apopka, New Jersey, High Springs, Florida, Pelican Rapids, Minnesota, Queen Creek, Arizona, Cincinnati, Ohio, a city named for General Washington, for Citizen Washington, as well as in Thailand, in Germany, in Venezuela, Norway, the United Kingdom. Thank you all for joining us. Now we will be hyped out on the road to Boston. Thanks for joining us.